Hello, everyone, and welcome to an Eat More Football Short. I'm Craig Candido, also known as Coach C. Today, I'm going to be talking about a much highly debated topic around the college football landscape, and that is, what is the best conference? Who is the best conference out there? Well, immediately, I know everybody, or maybe not everybody, but a lot of you start thinking that chant that we hear so often during the fall and all during the year, SEC, SEC. Well, is it truly the best football conference out there? And I'm not saying just from the national championship level, okay? We all know Alabama is dominated for the most part. LSU has been there in the last few years. But is it the top conference, top to bottom? Or is it a very top heavy conference to where there are teams at the top that compete every single year? And by the way, I forgot about your Georgia Bulldogs of the last year national champions. So I apologize for that. But Georgia, LSU, Alabama, every once in a while, forgive me, Auburn, for forgetting you as well. But I know my Alabama fans wouldn't be too high on that. So, but every once in a while, there'll be a wild card SEC team that makes a run. Of Florida in the past, way in the past, to Tennessee. You get my point, right? It's a top heavy conference when it comes to national championships. Obviously, there's only a few teams in that conference that have done it in the last 4 to 5 years. So is it top heavy or is it strong from top to bottom? I set out on a journey trying to figure this out. Myself and Natty Noah were having a conversation over text one night, and he's an SEC homer, like a lot of people are, right? He's a big Alabama fan. He believes that it's the top conference, regardless of any stat, of any number that I can pull out. So I started digging a little bit. I found a little bit of question whether or not the SEC was the top conference, top to bottom. Remember, top to bottom. So I dug. There was several different areas that I went into. Number one, I started with talent. Obviously, a football program cannot be good or championship level worthy without great talent. Okay. So I went in and I looked at the last 4 recruiting years, because we know in college football, anything past 4 years, that's a college career. And anything past that is old history. Right? The college football landscape changes so fast that anything past really a year to 2 now is old history. So I went back to 4 years just to give us a little bit better data set. So in the area of talent, I looked at the recruiting classes. The SEC has had the number 1 class the past 4 years, number 1 in terms of the top team at number 1 in those recruiting rankings, the last 4 years. In the last 4 years, the SEC's average rank of their class, all their teams ranked for each year on average, was number 20. Behind them was the Big Ten. Their average class was number 34 in the country, average team ranking. Average team ranking for the Pac-12 was number 40, tied with the Big 12 at 40, and then the ACC came in at 42. So just from a ranking perspective in recruiting, you see the SEC has the top spot. Now, some may argue with some of these recruiting services, their viewers are a lot from the SEC. So do these recruiting services cater towards those teams? They bump a guy because he signs or commits to a Alabama or a Georgia in those leagues. There has been some debate over those things over the years. I can't give you the answer, but sometimes it is mysteriously crazy how one guy goes from being a 3-star, suddenly Georgia likes him, he signs with the Bulldogs or he commits to the Bulldogs, and automatically he's bumped up to a 4-star. And sometimes the opposite happens. A 4-star maybe get a slight decrease if he falls through the cracks and doesn't sign with one of those big time programs and he falls to a lower level. Power Five team. He may lose a little bit of a rating. So you could debate that. But the bottom line is the SEC, per the recruiting rankings, and these came off of 247, okay, 247 rankings. The SEC average team was ranked 20, which is 14 spots above the next team in the college football. All right. So that talent, when it comes into college, how are we developing that talent in terms of going to the NFL? So the SEC, for the last 16 straight years, has had the most draft picks go to the NFL. We're not talking all first round or whatever round. This is just draft picks in general. On average, over the last 4 years, the SEC has averaged 64 players being drafted in the NFL draft. Second behind them is the Big Ten, 45 on average. And then the ACC and the Pac-12 are tied with 30 on average, and the Big 12 is at the bottom with 24. Now, I was curious. So I went back and I looked at the SEC because kind of like one of my theories, the top teams drive that. So you have a Georgia, for example, last year, they had 15 guys drafted off that national championship team. That's a lot of guys. And Alabama's been similar in years past where they dominated the number of guys drafted and were head and shoulders above the rest of the league in terms of draft picks. So I went back to see if the top teams in the league were dominating that for the league, if that makes sense. So are the leagues getting a lot of guys drafted because of the top level teams and then there's not much going on the mid to bottom levels? Or is it throughout the league that there's a lot of people getting drafted? So I went through, and on average, the SEC has draft picks from 13 teams in the league, 13 out of 14 on average. The Big 10, 12 teams, the ACC, 12 teams on average, the Pac-12, 10 teams, and the Big 12, 8 teams. Okay. So that again speaks to the SEC's dominance, that it's not just the Alabama, LSU's, Georgia's that are putting draft picks out. It's across the board that their league is producing draft picks, regardless of the team they're on. And only 43% of the SEC's draft picks were in those top 3 teams in the NFL draft. So let's say Georgia's got 15, Alabama's got 10, and LSU has 10. So on average every year, those top 3 teams in the league that have the majority of the draft picks, the most draft picks from the league, that's only accounts for 43% of the total draft picks from that league. You go to the Big 10, 47% for them. So their top 3 teams with draftees makes up 47% of their total league's draftees. And then it's the same for the ACC. 47% drops to 52% for the Pac-12, and Big 12 is 62%. So you see with the Big 12, the top 3 teams that are getting people drafted are making up over the majority of those players from that entire league, whereas the SEC, it's low 40%. So that means, to me, the league is stronger from a talent perspective, top to bottom. Okay, so that's talent. Leans towards the SEC, right? And trust me, I'm not an SEC homer, okay? I personally, in my career in the last 10 to 15 years, have seen the SEC, understood their good football programs, but being an assistant coach in the ACC for a few years in SEC country, in the heart of Atlanta, and we got to deal with all the SEC teams coming in our backyard trying to take the Georgia talent, right? In my heart, I want to believe that there are other leagues that can compete with the middle to bottom half. We know the top half, it's tough, right? From year to year, it's really tough to beat those guys. But is the middle to bottom half, are they comparable, or is the SEC running away with the entire thing? So let's look at the top 25. Again, a lot of people argue the hype preseason with SEC teams, they get the higher ranking, the more people ranked, and that enables them to stay in the top 25 longer. So at the end of the season, they have more teams. Well, Let's look at it. The last 4 years, the SEC postseason, okay, this is the final poll. The SEC has averaged 5 teams in the top 25. Big Ten, 4.5. Okay, that's an average. Obviously, you can't have a half team in the rankings, but on average, 4.5. Pac 12, 1.75 teams average that were in the top 25 at the end of the year. Big 12, 3.25, and ACC, 2.5. So you got the SEC, the Big 10, the Big 12, the ACC, then the Pac 12 in terms of teams finishing, number of teams finishing in the AP top 25 at the end of the year. So again, speaks to strength of conference. Now, everybody says great rankings. What do they mean, especially outside the college football playoff? They don't mean a lot if you're not in that top 4, to be quite honest with you, if you're worried about playing for a national championship. So let's talk about head-to-head, because that's probably a better measure of things when it comes to, hey, let's say Vanderbilt's playing Duke from the ACC. Sometimes those are comparable teams. Let's see who's going to win that football game. That's a better match than saying Clemson's playing, I don't know, Missouri. Obviously, the ACC is going to have a natural upper hand in that. Same thing if you talk about the SEC. Alabama playing Oregon State. Alabama's probably going to have the upper hand in that one. So we're not talking about just better teams versus worse teams in other conferences. This is a comprehensive look. And so I looked at it with head-to-head competition with bowls included. And I also looked at it without bowls included. Because everybody knows in the last 3 years, 2 or 3 years, what is the term that has become so popular? Opting out, right? Opting out of bowl games. What are my feelings on that? Okay. When I was playing, I would never opt out of a bowl game. We only made one in my 4 years at Navy. So it was a huge deal, and I would never have thought of opting out. But that being said, I understand it. I understand it when there's a lot of money on the line and an injury could cost you millions of dollars. I do. I understand that. From the one part I don't understand it, I feel like you bail on your teammates a little bit. Now, if it's the GoDaddy.com Bowl versus the Rose Bowl, now we're talking about a different conversation, right? Everybody knows that. Or national championship. Okay. I do think that it's gotten to be a little bit ridiculous with how many players opt out. But again, to each their own. Big boys make big boy decisions. And I cannot call anybody out for making the decision that they feel is best for their future, especially when it comes to football, because we all know your body is very limited on the amount of snaps that it can take in football. And you never know when that might be your last play. So, hey, do what you got to do. I think it's pretty much widely accepted now for opt-outs. So, off on that tangent, but I wanted to look at the records without bowl games being compared, because a lot of those bowl games, key players are out. They've opted out. And in the regular season, for the most part, you have most of your players, unless it's an injury or something like that. Most players are still playing with their full capacity, and their rosters are pretty much at full capacity as well. So you get a more realistic picture. But when we look at just head-to-head, bowls included, okay, bowls included, the SEC has a 62% winning percentage against all of their conferences. Okay, this is in the last 4 years since last 3 years, 2018, 19, 20, and 21. So 4 years, yeah. The next closest conference is the Big 12 and the Big 10. They're tied at 55% winning percentage versus other conferences. Then you've got the Pac-12 at 43%, and the ACC brings up the rear with 31%. Okay, 31% winning percentage against other conferences. Not too good, right? Same thing for the Pac-12, 43%, not too good. All the other three Power 5 conferences at least have a winning record against other conferences. Okay, when you break it down, some of the biggest things that stood out to me. Okay, let's talk about the SEC. SEC has dominated the ACC, 25-11 in those years. Big 10, 11-6 against the Big 10. Pac-12, 3-3, and then against the Big 12, 9-9. So that was a little surprising to me. The Big Ten, the SEC has pretty much handled, and then 500 against the Big 12 and the Pac 12. Okay. Pac 12, undefeated versus the ACC, 3-0, 2-11 versus the Big 12. So the Big 12 does not play well against, the Pac 12 does not play well against the Big 12. Pac 12 versus Big 10, Pac 12 is 9-9. And then, like I mentioned earlier, they're 3-3 against the SEC. Big 10 dominates the ACC, 14-6. Dominates the Big 12, 7-3. Tied with the Pac 12 at 9-9. Losing record versus the SEC, like I said, 6-11. And then we go to the Big 12, 500 versus the ACC as well. We talked about most of their records, and 11-25 versus the SEC. So very similar recruiting grounds at times. You can clearly see that they're not on the same playing field. All right, let's look at no bowls. All right, I didn't do the breakdown by conference against individual conferences, but let's look at the overall records outside of their conference against those other four Power 5 teams. So we have SEC with a 65% winning percentage if you take the bowls out against other conferences. We have the Big 10 with a 59% winning percentage if you take out other conferences. And then you've got the Big 12 at 46%, Pac 12 at 45%, and then the ACC with only a slightly bump up in their winning percentage if we take the bowls out at 33%. So clearly, again, the SEC owns the head-to-head dominance. All right, so the last couple things. Coaching, right? We talked about player talent. Let's talk about coaching talent. Who has the best coaches? So it's very subjective. So the best way that we can look at it is how a coach has been and how successful have they been in their career, their wins and losses. Not necessarily at the school they're at, but career-wise. The SEC, their coaches are winning career-wise at a 70% clip. Big 12, 66%. Pac 12, 65%, ACC, 60%, and Big 10, 58%. Now, that's surprising with the Big 10. 58% winning percentage in the Big 10 with their coaches career-wise. Okay? SEC, not surprising. Big hitters. Nick Saban, Brian Kelly now. Jimbo Fisher's got a pretty good amount of wins under his belt. Big 12, similar. You've got guys that have been in the league for a little while and accumulated some good wins. Pac 12, 65%. ACC, 60%. Mac Brown's a big part of that just in his career as well. But again, SEC has the best winning percentage in the coaching area. Attendance, last thing, because obviously attendance is very important. Support, we're talking about off-field stuff. The fans are coming out. Okay, again, you guessed it. SEC's not necessarily has the biggest stadiums because the Big Ten has some pretty big stadiums as well, but the SEC's filling those stadiums more often with a bigger amount of and a larger crowd than anyone else. 72,000. This was just from the 2021 season. Average 72,000 fans in SEC per game. This across the board, across every team. Big 10 was 65,000. Big 12, 55,000. Pac 12, 43,000. ACC, 42,000. So, again, what are we hearing over and over again? SEC, SEC. Again, this is my completely unbiased, objective view and research on these things. I would love to sit here and be able to tell you, hey, all the other conferences can match up minus Alabama, minus Georgia, minus LSU on several years, right? And we realize any given Saturday, that one team can beat another. Don't get me wrong. I understand that more than anybody. It all depends. But we're talking about a consistency across the board, not just one Saturday where somebody beats another team from another conference. What is the history? The last 4 years, the relevant years, that modern college football. All right. So you saw it. Ones across the board. SEC number one in every single category that we just talked about. Okay. Big 10 ends up number 2 when I rank all those categories out The Big Ten's number 2. The Big 12 will then be your third conference, followed by the Pac-12 and the ACC. So based on these metrics, recruiting talent from coming out of high school, transfers, NFL talent in the draft, top 25 rankings, national champions. Okay, I put that in there as well. National champions, head-to-head record without bowls and with bowls, average attendance, and then head coaching records. That's the order. SEC, Big 10, Big 12, Pac-12, ACC, based on those metrics. Okay, so probably not a surprise to a lot of you guys, but I thought it would be a good thing to kind of look into, considering there's a lot of talk every year, especially bowl season. Who's the best conference? Who's the best conference? Well, you SEC homers, you're like, yeah, tell me something I don't already know. Everybody else that wants to have that chip on their shoulder, say we're better than the SEC, guess what? It's not the case. Not the case in all these categories, which are probably the most important categories out there. And if you want to change that narrative, you've got a long way to go. So good luck to you. But we can say anything's possible, right? But for now, SEC, you are king. Signing off, Coach C.
Make sure to follow us on Instagram and Twitter at EatMoreFootball, and send in any questions about the show or sports or anything in general at our email, eatmorefb@gmail.com. That's Instagram and Twitter at EatMoreFootball, and email eatmorefb@gmail.com. See you next time.